Now, this is recording about the venous drainage of the central nervous system. Now, different from the other parts of the body, the drainage system of the CNS is a little bit different in a way that before they drain back from the venous capillaries back to the large venules and then larger veins and then into the main veins that leads to the superior or inferior vena cava. In the central nervous system, it is a little bit different in a way that there are these structures called the sinuses. Now, the sinuses are not actual blood vessels, as the actual blood vessels has the structure of the epithelial layer, the tunica interna, media, and externa. So without these structures, they are actually formed by the Dura Mater of the brain. Now let's just bring the brain up here. Brain. Okay, here we go. Now the brain, it's not showing the Dura Mater. Dura Mater of the brain. Now, as we get the dura out, we can sort of see that it might have been labeled with a different name. Let me try this folks, cerebral folks. Now the folks cerebri. This is just a part of the Dura Mater. That's the infolding of Dura Mater. So on this animation, since there were two different structures, I doubt they will be actually continuous. So I'll just try to explain from here that if we look from the frontal section of the brain, so again, we cut it on the frontal plane and then we look at it from the anterior side. I'll just try to draw. Now the Dura Mater, as they travel on the brain, adhere to the skull, they will do these infolds. They're actually attached to each other. Now, as the dura sort of travels to that area where the sinuses are, they would divide into two layers. Now we have the parietal layer and the visceral layer. The visceral layer meaning organ, and then close to the brain, the parietal layer would be the one that's attached to the skull. Now, the structure inside here that I'm trying to color would be the sinuses. Now, again, different from the blood vessels, these are formed by the Dura Mater, so they are not actual blood vessels, but they play a role in the drainage of the blood back into the heart, where they will get pumped into the pulmonary system, where they get reoxygenated, and out to the other parts of the body again. So that's the one difference between the circulation of the central nervous system and the other parts of the body. Now let's get started with the cerebral veins. The superficial cerebral veins, as you can see here, see if they highlight everything. Oh, it does. Fantastic. Now the superior cerebral vein, as you can see, let me just hide others. Oh, maybe not hide others, fade others. So you can see both on the medial and the lateral and the superior side of the brain, we see these drainage systems that all drain into this big structure in the middle, which is called the superior sagittal sinus. Let me just hide the folks here. Now, the superior sagittal sinus, as we mentioned earlier, not an actual blood vessel, but it's a drainage system of the venous blood, and then it would travel along the longitudinal fissure of the brain, superficially, of course, and back towards this place. Now, this is a place where we call the confluence. It's not actually labeled in this application here, but then it would be structured here. The confluence is basically the structure where all these major veins drains into. Now, we've covered the superficial cerebral vein. Now, there are these deep cortical regions, as we mentioned earlier, the central artery sort of gave oxygen to. They will need the blood heading in these deep structures will need to be drained as well. So I'll just try to remove some of the structures here so we can see what's hidden underneath. So here we can find the great cerebral vein, or sometimes called the great cerebral vein of Galen. It's just the name of, I think it's an anatomist, someone who discovered it. But anyways, so we have these internal cerebral veins that sort of drains these structures, the deep cortical structures, so the medulla, sorry, not the medulla, the thalamus, and the fornix, or etc. So these deep cortical structures are all being drained by the central veins, the internal cerebral veins, and then here going back to the great cerebral vein. Now another structure that's continuous, not continuous, sort of connected to the great cerebral vein, and then they would drain into this straight sinus, which we'll talk about in a second, is this one. It's also formed by the cerebral falx cerebri, which is the infolding of the Dura Mater along the longitudinal fissure. Again, it would drain blood. It would travel along the lining again of the corpus callosum, posteriorly and inferiorly, where they drain together along with the great cerebral vein into the straight sinus. Now, the straight sinus, it would receive blood from these two other larger veins and then drain itself into the infundibulum, I was going to say infundibulum, but the confluence. So now we have the drainage of the blood of the deep cortical structures, superficial structures on the medial side of the brain and the lateral and superior side of the brain. They would form, they would come here and drain into this confluence. Now, there is one other structure which was mentioned in the lecture. I think it was a little bit confusing just looking at the picture and then not knowing how that structure goes. That is the cavernous sinus that we talked about. So the cavernous sinus is this venous structure that is located posterior to posterior to your eye. Now, on this animation, it's a big bulb, but actually, if you go into the textbook and you will see like a network of these venous structures where you can see. Let me try to bring up the nerves. Right. So if we bring up the nerves, we can actually see these cranial nerves that travel. Oh, that's too much. All right. So you go. Right. So we can see these nerves. This is the trigeminal ganglion, and we can see these spinal cranial nerves that sort of travels along or through the cavernous sinus. So cavernous sinus is actually located in the space where we can find these cranial nerves and the internal carotid artery. So again, it's just a structure that sort of drains blood from other structures. For example, the ophthalmic, I think the ophthalmic artery is there as well. Just can't click it. So the ophthalmic vein would drain into the cavernous sinus as well, and then it would then travel backwards. And just remove the. Oh, by the way, the infolding of the Dura Mater, that wasn't the only one. The big one, the falx cerebri, was not the only one. There are other two structures called the Cerebellar Tentorium, and also here that divides the cerebellum. No, not really divide the cerebellum, but then went along that indentation of the cerebellum called the cerebellar falx. Right, let's get rid of those structures, and we can see the cavernous sinus. It would travel along the way, and then it would actually drain into this structure called the sigmoid vein here. Well, depending on sigmoid sinus, sorry, I was wrong. It's still a sinus over here. And depending on the anatomical variations, the majority of the time it would drain into this directly into the superior jugular bulb, which is just the beginning of the internal jugular vein, which would then travel inferiorly to the brachiocephalic trunk of the left or the right side, and then they would join together and become the superior vena cava. Now, all of the structures, except all of the venous structures, would drain eventually into the superior or venous or inferior vena cava, and then where the blood would then be sent to the pulmonary veins and get reoxygenated, and then the oxygenated blood would travel through the pulmonary veins. And sorry, I got a bit confused there. The superior and inferior vena cava would enter to the right atrium, to the right ventricle, and then it would exit through the pulmonary vein, which carries the deoxygenated blood, where it get reoxygenated, and then back into the circulation. So that's the drainage of the central nervous system. One last picture I'll just try to show you here to remove the right side of the brain. We sort of expose all of the structure over here. Now, this picture was also sort of illustrated in the lecture slide, where we can see, let's just review them, from superior sagittal sinus drains back into the confluence, and then the inferior sagittal sinus back in the confluence, firstly into the straight sinus. All right, into the straight sinus, and the straight sinus also receives blood from the great cerebral vein, which drains the deep cortical structures. Okay, and one thing I might have missed is these structures that as after the confluence, they would travel to the left or right side on the transverse plane and turns into the transverse sinus, where then they would become the sigmoid sinus with this S-shaped, and then drains down into the internal jugular vein. That's a funny word. So yeah, that's the general structures. This is the drainage venous structure of the brain. That's pretty much it. Now, there's a lot more detail that I did not mention or talked about, like the external venous structures, but since those were not covered in the lecture, I wouldn't spend extra time to just discuss them at this point. So, good luck with the studies.